My name is Jonathan Brent, and I'm editorial director of Yale University Press. And I would like to welcome all of you to this wonderful and indeed historic event. For our Russian guests, I would like to say Dobro Pazhalovat. I wish to thank Mark von Hagen, who is sitting here in the front row, who is director of the Harriman Institute at Columbia University, for co-sponsoring this event with Yale University Press. And I would like to thank the Yale Club for hosting it. Our distinguished panel, and it is indeed distinguished, consists of Edward J. Epstein, who will be the moderator of the panel, who is the author of many books, which I'm sure many of you know. He wrote certainly the finest book on the Kennedy assassination, The Assassination Chronicles, that was published a couple of years ago, a revised edition. He wrote a very important book called Deception, The Secret War Between CIA and KGB. And he wrote an extraordinary book, an award-winning book called Dossier, The Secret History of Armand Hammer, which was the secret history of, indeed, a very secret man, and it was a revelation to many people to have read it. I want to welcome Professor Anders Stephenson onto the panel. Professor Stephenson is a historian teaching at Columbia University. His specialization is the Cold War period. He is the author of George F. Kennan and the Art of Foreign Policy, and another book, Manifest Destiny, American Expansion in the Empire of Right. Second from the end is Major General Yuri G. Koboladze, who is chief of Russian Foreign Intelligence Service Press Bureau in Moscow. And for those of you who do not know, the Russian Foreign Intelligence Service is the successor to the KGB. At the end of the table is John Waller, who is former Inspector General of the CIA from 1976 to 1980, and is the author of several books, including The Unseen War in Europe, Espionage and Conspiracy in the Second World War. But it has been my great pleasure, and a pleasure I will treasure for my life as a publisher, to have worked with the two gentlemen in the middle. David E. Murphy, who has a distinguished career of 45 years in the CIA, now retired. In 1954, David Murphy came to Berlin as deputy chief of Berlin Operations Base under the legendary figure William King Harvey. In 1959, he became chief of the operations base. And Sergei Alexandrovich Kondrashov had a career of 48 years in Soviet intelligence. In 1953, he went to London, where he became George Blake's case officer and was responsible for the machinations of that most interesting British spy. In 1959, Sergei Kondrashov became chief of the German department of the KGB. This book has brought together these two former adversaries, and it is a historic book in many ways, both because of the story it tells and because it is the first collaboration ever between a former officer of the CIA and a KGB general. Their respective services, the CIA and the Russian Foreign Intelligence Service, cooperated in making available to us documents which had been hitherto top secret, completely unavailable, and so we owe also a debt of thanks to those two services, which are now beginning to release documents which make possible an understanding of the vast complexity of the Cold War, which was perhaps the greatest historical event of the second half of the 20th century. What I want to say as a publisher is that in a way this book was the fulfillment of a long ambition, which had its germination in 1991 for me, when it became evident that the archives of Eastern Europe, former Soviet bloc countries, were beginning to open up. And I went to Prague and learned of the availability of materials from Hungarian, Czech, and Polish archives. And at that point, I conceived a wild goose chase kind of a dream, and it's the sort of dream that happens maybe once in a lifetime to a publisher, that it would be an extraordinary thing if we could get a book published that would take KGB and CIA documents with officers or authors from both sides, which could put the documents together and thereby, putting them together, reveal the process by which intelligence and information became a tool in the hands of these two great adversaries, and thereby allowing us to explore the way that information became knowledge, and knowledge then became foreign policy, and foreign policy shaped all of our lives. And I went to Moscow in '92, and I met with some representatives, at least they called themselves representatives of the former KGB, and I made this proposition to them. And they looked at me quizzically, somewhat the way a laboratory technician looks at a mouse he's about to dissect. And they said to me, "You know, this is a fine dream. Why not? Go ahead and do it. It's great. We'll cooperate completely. But first, go back to the CIA and ask them to release the documents. And as soon as they release the documents, we will release every document you want." And so I came back to New Haven, and I thought to myself, well, I'm not Hercules after all, but this is certainly an Augean stable. And I despaired, frankly, of ever getting to that point. And then I discovered the existence of this collaboration. What is significant to me? That it shows how two systems operated at the height of a critical period filled with crises, any one of which could have led to war. It shows us how two systems oriented upon different principles of thinking and political organization constructed themselves out of knowledge. And it seems to me, admittedly, as an outsider and an amateur, that what was the weapon in this battle was not tanks and guns and rockets, though those were important, of course, but knowledge. That's what this book is about. It's a book that makes a difference, and that difference is what this panel is going to explore. And at this point, I would like to turn it over to Edward J. Epstein. There are one or two ground rules, which is that there will be a question and answer period at the end of the session. Please use the microphone that is standing there. If you do not use the microphone, you will be asked kindly to get up and do so.
Well, when I first began writing about the subject, when I first began writing about the subject of espionage, which was 20 years ago, I couldn't imagine that I'd be sitting here today with a former general of the KGB and a former equivalent, the Soviet bloc, the head of the Soviet bloc division of the CIA, and they had just collaborated on a book about the most sensitive and secret operations, which then I was trying to find out about. I was trying to find out then by interviewing the legendary James Angleton, now legendary, not then, and who was the head of counterintelligence, then retired. And I could just imagine what he would make of this union. But what this union has produced is an extraordinary Rashomon way of looking at events from two different sides, seeing things which maybe neither side could have seen themselves, and coming to some synthesis. Espionage or secret intelligence is a enterprise that is basically illegal, at least in the country in which it's practiced. It involves stealing the secrets of your enemy in a surreptitious way so that they don't know that they're stolen. And this can be done either through human agents, who are usually nationals of the country you're spying on, who are somehow induced or compromised into acting as a traitor and providing secrets, or it can be done through technical means by connecting a wiretap or overhearing conversations electronically or through overhead reconnaissance. What the Berlin station of the CIA was involved in the early 1950s was a massive tap into German, East German, and Soviet communications. The Berlin Tunnel, Operation Gold, whatever it was called, it was basically building a tunnel a quarter of a mile long, 6 feet in diameter, in a way that the Russians wouldn't know we were building it, and then getting into their communications. The plan, I think, began in '54, and it lasted just under a year before the Soviets found out. Now, at the same time that this tunnel was going on, the Soviets had recruited a British spy called George Blake, who Jonathan mentioned in his introduction. George Blake was important in this case because he was the liaison with the CIA and American intelligence operation in Berlin, and was actually taking notes as they were planning this tunnel. Now, General Kondashe, you were the case officer for George Blake.
That's correct.
From 51 on. Did he tell you about this tunnel?
Yes, sit down. Speaking to the mic.
Yes, I was case officer of George Blake. I was sent to London especially for that purpose, to work with George Blake in '53, and started working with him. At one of the first meetings with George Blake, he passed me a top secret document of British SIS, 90 pages report on the results of their listening devices of tapping the Soviet lines of communications in Austria and Hungary. That was already a great success. Then later on, in the very beginning of '54, George Blake at one of the meetings passed me new documents, and among these documents was the original carbon copy of the minutes of a top secret conference between SIA and British SIS on the plans to build a tunnel in Berlin, how to plan it, how to construct it, how to deal with the material, how to process the material, how many interpreters are needed, and so detailed plan of building and of functioning of the Berlin Tunnel. As far as I remember, there were 6 or 7 pages.
And just to be clear, this was before the tunnel was actually constructed.
Well, that was the discussion of the first discussion of the idea of building of a tunnel in Berlin. It was said where from this tunnel should go and to what point in the Soviet sector and to what line it should be tapped.
Okay, Dave, I'm going to get to you in a second. I just have one more question and we'll come to you. And you passed this information on to your superiors in the Soviet intelligence service.
The information was of such a vital and, I would say, crucial importance that I passed it directly to the Chief of Soviet Intelligence.
So we know now that Soviet intelligence knew about the tunnel for the entire 11 months that it operated, and it was a very large operation with a huge warehouse and everything else. Now, I want to go to Dave Murphy. You were the deputy chief of the station in Berlin at that time, right?
Right.
And this tunnel was extremely important to the American intelligence effort.
Yes, I think we should clarify the origins of the tunnel. It began in terms of the planning in late 49, early 50, when it became apparent that the Soviet Union was moving from radio transmissions to landlines, to buried cables, therefore depriving intelligence consumers in London and in Washington of the rich intelligence they'd been accustomed to. And that's how we got started. Planning began actually in 1952 and continued through 52 and 53 until the first spade was put to ground in August of 1954.
And it became operational in February?
The actual tunnel construction was completed in February. The British then came in and ran a vertical shaft up to the cable, and they were the ones who carried out the actual tap. They brought in specialists from the General Post Office who were experts in this, and we could never have done it without that.
Brilliant operation. Now, did you know, or did you have any reason to suspect that for the entire 11 months it was operating and listening to the Soviets knew about its existence, or did you think it was secret from them?
We were absolutely convinced that they had no knowledge of this because the material pouring into us, hundreds of thousands of classified conversations, 4,000 yards a day of teletype messages from every element of the Soviet presence in Germany and Poland, the Army, the Air Force, the intelligence services, their relations with East Germany, their exploitation of East German uranium deposits. All of that was coming in, was being processed, and turned out as intelligence reports. So we could not...
Extremely valuable intelligence.
It was valuable because at the time, don't forget, we're dealing with a period in which there was no overhead, there had been no U-2 flights, the only thing we could rely on was the occasional defector, and a very difficult job of trying to cover the both East Germany and Poland with human sources, because by that time the Stasi, the East German Security Service, which was created by the KGB, had developed into a very effective service. And therefore, the tunnel was providing unique information which could not have been obtained by any other means.
And which the Soviets knew about. I want to ask Sergei, why did you allow this? Why did you allow this tunnel to go on for 11 months?
The irony of your question is the following. The KGB has not only foreign intelligence or internal security departments, but also the KGB is responsible for the security of government lines of communications. But we certainly have decided from the very beginning that the identity of George Blake should remain intact, and we should avoid at all costs the danger of he being discovered. And so in order somehow to dampen the effects, somehow to cut the effects of the tunnel, we were certainly conscious that the enormous material was going on to the other side. We have done the following way. We actually tapped our own lines ourselves and then presented the Minister of Defense with the document which was giving him the knowledge of how talkative his officers were over the government lines and how talkative were sometimes diplomats. And so we asked him, certainly without any allusion to the George Blake, to our source, so we asked him to take necessary measures to somehow to shorten the talkativeness. Well, the Minister of Defense took some measures, but I must say these measures were not enough in order to somehow to to shorten or to curb the effects and the consequences of the Berliner Tunnel and the enormous. We are conscious of the enormous material, intelligence material, which American side and the British side have got through the tunnel.
Well, Sergei, did you ever consider using this line, this open line that you knew that the CIA was listening to plant one or two pieces of misinformation or disinformation?
You see, as a practical officer in these matters, I must say that it's impossible to combine the disinformation with enormous amount of factual information going through the lines, because very simple analysis would show the other side that this is disinformation and this is not. So more than that, the Chief of Intelligence has chosen one of his deputies, General Tishkov, to supervise that not a bit of materials received from George Blake could be used in such a way as to compromise his identity.
Now, Dave, in writing this book and working on it and doing the research, did you come to a better understanding of an issue like this and other issues?
Well, I certainly did. This might be an opportune moment for me to, before I talk about that broad a subject, to pay tribute to someone who's here tonight that I owe a great deal to, and that's James O'Shea Wade. He conceived the idea for this Berlin book, and he persuaded me that I should be involved. Well, let me tell you, I had never given interviews to anyone in the media. I'd never been involved in that, and it was a tough sell. But more important, he convinced me that I could write such a book. And he spent a lot of agonizing time working over my first efforts. So I want to thank Jim Wade tonight. Now, back to
I just want to know, what did you feel that you learned by doing this book? Did you add enormously to your understanding of these issues now that you could see them from both sides? And with
Well, one of the questions that question has been asked, I would say, many, many times in various ways. What were the surprises that you encountered? The one thing that struck me is that when I looked at the intelligence reporting that the Soviet Foreign Intelligence Service had in the early period, the periods of crises in Berlin, the Berlin blockade, later the Khrushchev ultimatum in 1958, the level of intelligence that they had on Washington, Bonn, London, Paris was enormous. The sources they had, a legacy of their work in the period between the two wars, agents such as Philby, Donald McLean, Guy Burgess, were absolutely fantastic. Nonetheless, this information, which, as I said, was superb. For example, at a crucial moment in the fall of 1948, when the decision was whether or not the Allies would really stick with it, we received, or I should say, the Foreign Intelligence Service received, I only saw it much later, the minutes of a British cabinet meeting, a special meeting held over the weekend in London to discuss this very issue. The result of these reports would be to convince anyone that the Western Allies would not leave Berlin. Stalin, on the other hand, ignored this first-class reporting, and this was not something that died with him. This kind of response by men who were ideologically with blinders on continued up through Khrushchev and later. That was the biggest surprise for me.
Maybe I will comment on that,
yes,
if
I
may.
may ask you the same question.
No, not quite the same question, but I would wish to comment on the statement by David Murphy just now. Well, it's often being alluded that the Soviet foreign intelligence had acquired important sources of information before the war. Well, that is certainly correct, but I wish to underline that after the war and the effect of the Allied victory and Soviet victory in the last war was such that in many countries, not only in Germany, but in Germany, Great Britain, France, and even the United States, there is a number of people who were willing to cooperate with Soviet foreign intelligence. Why? Because they were connected with the future role of the Soviet Union after the war, their own perspective, their own future. So we had a number of very important acquisitions, I mean by source of information, with the people who were cooperating with us because they thought that it would be useful for their own career. Thank you.
Well, you're talking in the past tense. Isn't this espionage activity still going on? Didn't we have the Ames case in 1992 and a more recent case in the CIA? Aren't the Soviet intelligence services still pursuing this activity? Or do you think that this phase of the Cold War is over?
It's very hard for me to comment on Ames case because I had
No, but I mean, the point is that there are recruits still being made. Do you think that the intelligence war is now over or that it's just simply continuing?
Intelligence war is probably over, but intelligence activity is by far is not eliminated.
And will the movement towards bringing NATO east intensify this or have any effect on it? The expansion of NATO.
The expanding of the NATO certainly raises by many of my colleagues the necessity to activate our foreign intelligence, because certainly the expansion of NATO creates a new dangerous situation. I wish to say in this connection that I regard our book as a sort of a plea to the public opinion and to the rulers in this world that they will take into consideration the lessons of Cold War, because Cold War is easy to unleash, but is very difficult to finish and very difficult to overcome its consequences.
Do you agree with that assessment, Dave? Do you think it's an ongoing affair?
Well, do I think that nation states will continue to resort to clandestine intelligence to determine those facts that are not readily and openly available to them when there's an issue of national importance, when the national interest is at stake? I certainly do believe
and they'll
that.
maintain services and establishments to do that.
They certainly will.
Well, you know, on this question of the Cold War, I thought we might bring Professor Stephenson into the discussion. And I believe you had a question, which...
Yes, I do. An old CIA friend of mine, before this event began, asked me what on earth I was doing on this panel, since I'm not an espionage expert, though I have more than an auxiliary interest in it. This book, I think it should be made clear, is not only a cloak and dagger story. It's not chiefly a cloak and dagger story about the various aspects of the Looking Glass War in Berlin, nor is it even about or only about a certain kind of bureaucratic organizational problem of how to procure, organize intelligence or information. It's also framed in terms of a Cold War history or a history of Cold War Germany and USSR intentions in that particular theater, very crucial theater, central theater of the early Cold War between 45 and 61. So I think one should actually bring that aspect out into the open and put it into question. There are two sort of aspects of the framing of this book that I find interesting, problematic, not necessarily, wrong or questionable in a sort of ethical way, but nevertheless to be put into question. The first one has to do with Jonathan's introduction, but also with some of the arguments that are present throughout the narrative. And that has to do with the question of ideology. Roughly speaking, the argument is a certain kind of asymmetry. On the one hand, the West, the United States in particular, had inadequate sources of information, inadequate sources of intelligence, tried valiantly and so forth, and did pretty well considering the circumstances, but didn't quite get to the stellar level that the KGB, its predecessors and successors did. as we heard, cabinet minutes of the most sensitive and secret negotiations within the West, within specific governments and so forth. The asymmetry lies not in that, though. The asymmetry lies in the fact that because the Soviets were stuck in their ideology, because the Soviets were wearing ideological blinkers, they couldn't make any good use of this information. They got stellar information from Blake, Philby, and so forth, but because they were mired in their totalitarian ideology or whatever, Stalinist ideology, they couldn't actually act on it. They couldn't actually make intelligent use of intelligence. Now, to me, that's questionable. That is to say, to me, the most ideological of moves is to say that the other guy is the ideologist, that ideology is what, in fact, the other guy is doing. And in a number of instances in the book, and I'd like to hear Dave sort of comment on this as well, Sergei, the CIA estimates, which seem to me utterly steeped in ideology, maybe a better ideology, I'm not taking a position on that, I'm just saying it seems to me as ideological in every respect as the KGB estimates, and often off the mark, in fact. But they're nevertheless used in the book in the way the narrative is constructed as a measure of the accuracy of the Soviet side, such that one gets, the CIA has a report in 1949 that says X. Now the KGB or its predecessors says Y. And we see that this discrepancy between these two estimates actually vastly increased the tension at this very crucial moment of the Cold War. Now, to me, that's questionable in terms of how the book is pitched. So I want you to comment on that framing. The other frame has to do with, well, which is part and parcel of the same thing, has to do with the overarching narrative as such. Sergei comes in kind of in a subsidiary way. You have a distancing operation that goes on from the beginning, which is to say you refer to yourself in the third person. Dave Murphy says X or does Y, and Sergei similarly. But there is also a number of references in which Sergei is referred to as Kondratyov claims, or Kondratyov insists, or according to Kondratyov's logic, it is such and such. In that sense, it seems to me that Kondratyov's voice in this and the KGB voice and the Soviet position is subsidiary, brought in to support or to disclaim a certain kind of conception of the events. The Soviet understanding of what was going on in Germany, and in particular the understanding of what the West was doing, the project of the West with regard to German unification, which was the central issue of the Cold War in Europe, is not, I think, foregrounded in the way that I would have expected the KGB and the Soviet historians to do. So I want to ask Sergei, given that the Soviet goals, as stated in Germany, were very straightforward: demilitarization, denazification, decartelization, negatively, as expressed in the Potsdam Accords, and positively, also as in the Potsdam Accords, are reparations, money, resources. What was your existential or experiential understanding within the KGB when it came to the what must have been very hard to understand from a Russian-Soviet standpoint, the maximalist position on the part of the West in Germany with regard to the conditions on which Germany could conceivably be unified? George Kennan, to be parochial for a minute, in 1952 sat as ambassador in Moscow with no instructions except a single one, not to talk about Germany with Moscow. He wrote a famous dispatch saying the Russians must think that we're up to some kind of sinister plot, given that we have every advantage in Germany, given that we're sitting on the overwhelming majority of the resources, the public opinion is behind us. the industrial resources are under control. The Marshall Plan is a gigantic success. Why we're not pushing with every means conceivable to unify Germany, even if it is in a kind of demilitarized sense, must seem to the Soviet Union as utter absurdity. And I'm just curious, because in the book I got none of that kind of what does a bureaucrat in the KGB with Germany as a specialty think about this as far as an understanding of the West. I mean, I thought the CIA side of this was very well expressed.
We basically have two questions here, right?
Yes.
First, we want to know whether the book argues that there's an asymmetry between the CIA and the KGB in the sense that the CIA is free of ideology and the KGB is mired in it. I mean, that's to some degree. And secondly, we want to know whether your policy considerations, political policy considerations, affected your intelligence work. And both these questions are addressed to Sergei, or
no,
I've
obviously not cast aspersions on Dave's
well, let's start with Sergei.
I want to sort of
Okay, no, I've just rephrased the questions. So we'll let Sergei answer them, but thank you.
I got it. I think I got the main meaning of it. Well, it was not quite a question, it was a statement, and I cannot abstain from answering this statement. Well, you see, in first hand, KGB and foreign intelligence were not a policy-making body. Our task was to supply our leaders, to supply the government, and to supply the Central Committee with the exact information, or possibly exact information. What are the West German plans for reunification? What are the Western plans for reunification? And in view of the existence of our own plans of reunification of Germany. Because certainly it's not a secret that we, when just after the war, and that I would say relating not only to the position of Stalin or any other member of the government, Stalin or no Stalin, the Soviet Union at that time could not disregard how the Germany will develop in future, because at all costs we had to avoid the new dangers coming from militaristic Germany, or from militarists in Germany. And that was the, so to say, the starting point for the task which stood before the Soviet intelligence. So we had to supply our government with the exact information about the plans of Germany, West Germany, I mean, Great Britain, France, United States, etc., etc. And I must say that with a great deal of satisfaction that in the first years of the war, after the war, we were able to supply our government with most acute and I would say very wide information about the plans which were developed in the Western countries with regard to the future of Germany. Our own objectives, as reflected, was in the tasks which were laid before the Soviet foreign intelligence, were that the tasks of Soviet Union consisted in reunifying Germany, but having Germany reunified on such a terms that it will be in future friendly to our country and not represent any more danger to our country. And certainly we were supplying, I would say, the information about Western positions, how to include West Germany into the Western camp, how to influence the West German development. All that we were supplying our government. What our leaders have done with that information, that's quite another question. Because we are responsible for our information, but not for the decisions made by the government, made by the politicians, made by Central Committee, made by the government on basis of our information. And more than that, I wish to say that even at the very, or just a few days before the war, when Stalin was put, before Stalin was put the information about impending war in 2 or 3 weeks' time, he was full of disbelief. He called to himself the chief of Soviet foreign intelligence, General Fitin, and in a sort of a ridiculous manner asked him, who is this source of information who is reporting to you that the war is bound to begin in 2 weeks' time? Tell me, please, how you characterize it? And when General Fitin said that the information comes from the most reliable source, that there is no doubt about the validity of information, that there is no doubt in the truthfulness of the report of this source. Stalin still didn't believe it. Well, why it was? Well, I may say that not only Stalin, but a number of our leaders had a great deal of misconceptions, that's my point of view, about the future of Europe, about the future of the world after the war. And on many occasions, they have acted in complete disregard of the information laid before them. Although I must say that according to personal evidence and archival evidence, I must say that Stalin was very attentive reader of the information. Now in our archives we have many documents with his marking with the famous blue pencil, underlining certain words, passages, phrases, and or simply marking texts which meant that he read it all thorough very well. So, but that's, I would say, to begin with.
No, I
but
understand.
later on I'm ready to expand on this.
That basically, you visualize the KGB as a service organization that was servicing the political leadership, not making policy. And you do see the professor's point that ideology sometimes caused information to be rejected. I want to know what Dave thinks about this asymmetry.
Well, let me speak.
Or whether you believe in it, yes.
Well, of course. Let me speak to the questions raised both by Anders and by you in summarizing them. In the first place, you will note the absence from the book of the kind of collated all-source analysis which from the KGB side, which appears in some of the quotes that we have taken from the analyses, the weekly and the national estimates, for example, that were done by the CIA Directorate of Intelligence. They were responsible for collating and analyzing and producing reports on issues which had a broad background. This did not exist in the KGB. It was a long time before they developed the kind of information directorate that produced this kind of collated, integrated intelligence. What we have to go on is the reporting that we have from the archives, the KGB archives, and interviews with KGB officers who served in Berlin at the time. So in a sense, it's a technical question. I make no apology for the tenor of the comments, even the ideological tenor of the comments by some of my former DDI colleagues, but that's the way it was. But there is an asymmetry in terms of the way both services dealt with the intelligence they had.
Do you think we had an advantage over the Russians?
Well, I think to some extent we did, because there was simply no mechanism that existed on the Soviet side early on to integrate all source information, except in the minds of and in the heads of the actual users. And no one is capable of having the background needed to arrive at a decision without some help. Let's take the Korean War, for example. We've discussed remilitarization of Germany. Certainly, the Berlin blockade, the February putsch in '48 putsch in Prague, caused great concern and did lead to the creation of NATO. But NATO, by the winter of '49-50, was a paper organization. You had the invasion of South Korea by the North, and the view that was the attitude that drove that in Stalin's entourage was concerned over the situation in East Asia, a relationship with the new communist Chinese government, concerned about relations with Mao Zedong himself. there seemed to have been little, if any, concern given. And this is as the result of recent scholarship based on documents that have been made available, say, for example, by the Soviets, or by the Russian government to the South Korean government. There seemed to be no concern for what the impact would be on Europe and Germany. Here was the first time since the war ended that the status quo established at war's end was being challenged by force of arms. Everyone in West Berlin, in West Germany, in Europe generally, felt that this was a possible threat. And the consideration of bringing Germany into the Western defense system would obtain an enormous push from the effects of the Korean War.
I don't think you're going to his point.
Well,
because what he's saying is that did the leadership always accept the NIE and the other CIA estimates? I mean, that's the asymmetry he's talking about, is whether the leadership accepted or rejected the CIA information.
Well, that's the second aspect of it. As I said, I cannot critique at this stage the language used in the CIA estimates, but if they reflected generally a concern over Soviet actions in East Germany and the creation within East Germany of a state whose political, economic, and military activity seemed to pose a threat. And when this threat on which we reported in great deal from 1946 to 1948, the reporting from Berlin Operations Base detailing the nature of these changes. For example, the forced merger of the German Communist Party and the Social Democratic Party in Germany, creating a single one-party system. We reported on that in great depth. In fact, we were the first ones to report on this in Germany in 1946. This created apprehension, created concern. When this was followed by the blockade and then followed by the Korean War, I think there's no question about the fact that there was concern. I wouldn't put it against a preconceived ideological framework of the kind that, in a Marxist-Leninist sense, but there was concern.
Well, let's go back to Sergei's perspective. Did you think that the CIA had an advantage when you were involved in Soviet intelligence, or did you think the Soviets had an advantage?
I would rather comment on this last statement by David Murphy. You see, at that time, shall we say, first years 52, 53, 54, 55, we naturally were reporting from Germany what is the situation, what is the pressure from the American side to rearm Germany, what are the practical steps. You see, we had extensive information, and it's all in documents now, of this sort of a process going on. But at the same time, certainly we, as officers, we knew what the impact is on the atmosphere in the West because of the Korean invasion. I mean, the invasion from North Korea to the south.
Here we
were conscious, but we were very, I would say, carefully formulating any allusions to the after effect of the Korean War on the situation in Germany, because we certainly wanted to avoid at all costs the direct reference of the situation in Germany with the events in Korea.
But here we have a case, a very interesting one, and not unexpected, where your perspectives diverge. You both see your services in a different way than your opponent sees your services. Isn't that correct? And did that affect, when you were writing the book, that you had your different perspectives?
I think we have succeeded to give a picture in the book which reflects our both sides' opinion and actually giving the correct understanding of the situation of that time.
Right, I do too. Dave, do you have? I don't know if you answered Anders' question about why the book was written in the third person, or why your voice seemed dominant.
Well, I think that's an impression, and which arises from the fact that the book was written for an English-speaking audience. That we did not have the kinds of analyses of statements of Soviet policy, which could have been placed side by side. Now, we also had, in addition to that, the problem of of space and of length of the book. And so one did the best one could to present an intelligence book, link it to the historical issues at the time, and try to show how intelligence played a role, or indeed in some cases, as Sergei has said, was ignored.
Maybe
Two questions for you. Oh, sorry, yes.
Just to complete the answer to Andrew. He alluded that there are in the book such formulas as Kondrashov alluded, Kondrashov maintains, Kondrashov claims, etc., etc. What does it mean? I had an information in a document which underlined my position. But in the book, I was unable to insert the source so actually has commented in such a way. So actually in the book there is a formula Kondrashov claimed, because I was basing my opinion on the information which I had in my possession. Thank you.
I want to ask John Waller a question. As a former Inspector General of the CIA, where you needed an overall picture of how the organization worked, what do you think of this collaboration in the book it produced? Do you think it did produce a very interesting or novel history, or do you feel that still the limits of public disclosure in some way restrict the information that emerge?
It's my opinion that the book quite artfully captures what it sets out to do. And I'm quite amazed by it, as a matter of fact, the degree of detail and the degree of insight from both sides. And I'm quite amazed, too, how much was released by both sides for use. The more one studies this problem, or allied problems, the more one is aware of the fact that there's no one book this thick that can say it all. And the thing is a very, as we all know, the history by itself is not an easy thing to master or to be accurate about. But the wartime and the post-war, the Cold War history is a fantastically convoluted thing with an awful lot of information still missing on what happened or what was thought or what was done. So this isn't the last definitive work on it, but it is a beautiful beginning in which more was thrown into the hopper to be digested than I ever imagined could have been possible.
And as long as we're on the release of information, General Kovalatz, can you give us some idea of why the Soviets released the information that's available in this book? What was their interest, or what was their incentive?
First of all, let me tell you that having been involved in book publishing for 5 years now, I want to tell you that it's much more difficult to publish books than to spy.
Hear, hear.
And I want to tell you that probably you know that it's only part of a bigger project, and it's the second book of this project, and the first one was published this year in America, and it's about to be published in Russia, and we'll have 2 books next year. And when we decided to go with this project in '92, the situation was that for many, many years, for reasons obvious to you, we neglected the study of the history of intelligence service. And of course the territory was occupied by foreign scholars. And I do remember that in '92 I popped into a big bookstore in Washington, and there were hundreds of books written on Russian intelligence by foreign scholars. And I thought it was wrong, and we decided to change the pattern. And now we have, I think, fantastic result when we released hundreds of documents, and I think that we contributed to the better understanding of the history of the world, the history of the Cold War, and the history of Russian intelligence. And this was our purpose, and I think that we will go on with this process, and I hope that we'll have many interesting books to come.
Are a lot of former agents involved in now declassifying Soviet documents to become a major form of employment, or how, for these books?
Foreign agents? What do you mean?
No, I didn't mean foreign. intelligence, sorry, former ex,
Oh, I see.
or even present.
Jesus, it's a very complicated process, you know. I want to tell you that not everybody is so happy in Russian intelligence that we are releasing these documents. So.
That's very correct.
But my leadership and supports the project. You know, the project was started by Mr. Primakov, who was then the head of Russian intelligence and now the Minister of Foreign Affairs. And the present chief of intelligence, he understands how difficult it is, and I have his backing. But sometimes, of course, we come across with strong opposition. But, you know, after all, we are intelligence service, so we are accustomed to overcome difficulties. But mind you, I am very proud that the book is published, and I am very grateful to David and Sergei and George Bailey, because they were easiest authors to handle, because both of them, David and Sergei, they know the territory. Sergei Kondrashov, he was in active service for
49 years.
49 years, he knows everybody in intelligence, and nobody can say no to him. And when we have the author who is not that experienced, who didn't have experience with intelligence service, of course it's more difficult to go, you know, to overcome all these, you know, procedures and difficulties.
If you don't mind, I'd like to open a discussion from questions from the floor, which can be, please you have to go to the center microphone and address your question, name yourself and address your question to any panelist that you want to answer it. Oh yes, and make the questions brief.
This will be brief.
They have to be very brief
Be
because
very
we want to
brief.
get in
Be
many questions.
brief if you let me talk. Okay. My name is Paul Myers. It's to Sergey and to David both. Yes, okay. Yeah. Can you hear me? The mic's not on. Mic is on.
The mic's on.
Is the mic on now? Well, I'll say it as loud as I can. You spoke about misconceptions that Stalin had and other leaders about the future of Europe, and I'd like to know what those misconceptions were. And also, David, do you feel that on the American side of that there were similar kinds of misconceptions about where? And I'd like to know what those were as well. Thank you.
You go first.
Misconceptions of Stalin.
I had a chance of seeing Stalin, and I would only probably say the following thing, which is important to understand Stalin and assessment of his. Certainly you all realize here that the mass trials, persecutions, and that kind of thing, which certainly made many offers of the best people in our country, contributed to worsening of the atmosphere before the start of the last war. So I would say that certainly we entered the war under influence and the impact of these negative developments during the Stalin period. But I wish to say, in the course of the war, all nations of the Soviet Union have come together very closely. There was no difference who is fighting on the front, Russian or Kalmyk or Georgian. So we entered the war with these kind of feelings of a negative character. We ended the war united as a nation. And that was certainly one of the great achievements by Stalin.
The Kalmyks were on another side, according to Stalin, weren't they? The Kalmyk population.
Oh, yes.
They
well,
were
you
all
see,
deported.
this problem is not very easy to answer. Certainly, the mass deportation now is condemned in the most decisive manner, and that is correct. but I wish to say, and that I cannot abstain from saying that, but unfortunately, we had in several regions, I would say, massive demonstrations of sympathies to Germans, to German forces. They were very quickly overcome when in a couple of several months after the beginning of the war, the German atrocities became known. So, but some of these deportations were caused by the instability of certain regions. We certainly condemn that. That's not the method to solve the national problems, and we condemn Stalin for that, for these deportations.
I don't think that Stalin is really the subject of Battleground Berlin, but Dave, do you have...
Well, I'd like to respond to the question. Okay. Misconceptions. What were the misconceptions on the Soviet side? I think it's perfectly clear that on the part of Stalin and people around him, that they misjudged the West. They did not understand the West. They were convinced, for example, that following the end of the war in America, there would be a massive depression on which they could plan and reckon with the future. But they weren't alone in misconceptions. When many of the American military leaders began to function within the framework of the Potsdam Declaration in 1945, men like General Clay, for a brief time Eisenhower before he left, and many others felt certainly that they could and should cooperate with their Soviet opposite numbers. They had little understanding, in fact, in some cases, no understanding of the nature of the Soviet system. They didn't realize, for example, that a Marshal Zhukov was not free to make policy, was not free to speak openly and freely. As Zhukov's driver said, Zhukov was never allowed to be alone with Stalin, and he always had someone there, either the secret policeman Serov or Vyshinsky, who was the political advisor. So that misconception took a while. It wasn't until the fall of '47, after repeated breakdowns and discussions within the Allied Control Council, that Clay began to realize that there wasn't much he could do to change Soviet policy with respect of its own zone and how it was handling that zone.
And we expected a major Soviet attack, didn't we, in '46 and '47? Was that part of America? A Soviet attack on Western Europe, talking of misconceptions.
No, the expectation of an attack or of actual war began in March of 1948 with the impending blockade and the crisis over harassment of our access to and from West Berlin, West Germany. And it was Clay himself who sent an agonizing telegram back to the War Department in 1948, predicting or suggesting at least that there would be a war. Now, this contradicted Berlin operations base reporting, because it was perfectly clear to us from the sources we had in the Soviet Army, in the East German Party, the Communist Party, the SED, and in East German paramilitary forces, that there was no way they could engage in a major ground war with the West at that time. Not that the West was that much better off, but they weren't prepared to go to war. Gradually, Clay began to understand this, and his own reactions became calmer, and that is why we moved to the airlift. There was no intent, no desire to test the Soviets on the ground, but rather to resort to an airlift to feed and supply Berlin.
Okay, well, I think that clearly answers the question. What is the next question, please?
I'm Gabriel Schoenfeld. My question is for Sergei Kondrashev. Mr. Kondrashev, you were a loyal servant of a regime which, in the period when you were serving, it sent millions of people to the Gulag. And I'm just wondering whether you have any regrets about your service to that regime in those years.
I was serving my country in my understanding, and there was no other perspective for me. And when it was suggested to me to enter into the service and to serve my country, and I wish to say that this proposal to me was put forward before in 44. And let me finish first. Well, yes. So this proposal was put before me in 44, and just imagine, I was a young man of 21. 2 years ago, in 42, my father perished he was a volunteer in Moscow division, voluntary division. And so at that very moment, just imagine a young man who would refuse to serve his country in the midst of the war. So I was unable to refuse. That's why I entered the service. Then I wish to say that my career was not so, I would say, without any clouds. I wish to say that, for instance, in 51, 52, there was a moment when all my superiors in one night were arrested. So just imagine, I am at that time was deputy chief of the American Department of our counterintelligence, a captain, and my chief was General Utechin. At about 12:30 in the after midnight, we were working at that moment officially till midnight, but stayed also later. An officer comes to my room and says, let's go to the room of General Utechin. We go there, and he takes his coat, and assembles the papers from his table. I understood that he was arrested. So in this very night, the chief of counterintelligence was arrested, my chief was arrested, many other chiefs were arrested. I thought at that very moment that the time has come for me to quit the service altogether. And I applied, officially applied, put such an application on the table of the Deputy Minister of State Security. And my application was declined, and instead I was transferred to the foreign intelligence because of my knowledge of foreign languages and already operative successes. So I was able to continue my career in foreign intelligence. Well, if you ask me whether what are my feelings, certainly I am not happy that my country now in such a state as I see it now. Because during my 49 years of service, I was thinking that I was contributing to the security of my country. Now, certainly, I am disillusioned because of the situation which I observe now.
Okay. Let's move on to the next question. Thank you.
This question is for our two Russian guests. Would you tell us whether Alger Hiss was a Russian agent?
We want to know
Congress knows better.
Hiss's status. Sergei, do you have any first-hand or second-hand knowledge?
That's not my case.
And Yurik?
When will those Russian archives be open to let us know whether who were Russian agents working in America?
So the southern part of archives, intelligence archive.
Okay. I think we have to restrict it to one question because there's a line of people.
So the southern part, operational part of Russian archives or American intelligence archives will never be open to general public for obvious reason, because the paramount task of any intelligence service is to protect its sources. That's why there are certain cases which we're never going to discuss. And I think that it's quite understandable.
I don't think any files after 1932 are open to the general public that I know of.
It really doesn't depend on the year. We have to go cases by cases, you know. There are certain cases we are prepared to open even which occurred last year or this year. But
Next question.
My name's Lawrence Clark, and I'm very impressed by you gentlemen. I was in World War II, 5 battle stars. And I must say I believe that under some circumstances we should have some sort of a celebration that the United States and Russia didn't go to war. But in any event, this is directed at the two authors and to the general. What do you plan, not what, but do you plan to be allies or enemies?
Okay. Let's start with Dave.
Let's start with something else.
Do you have a view on this?
I wish to say that according to the decisions taken at the Tehran conference of the Big Three, there was a system of cooperation between Russian and British secret services, and then between Soviet and American secret services. How would that develop? I think maybe we both answer, but I will start, and David, I see he is already on the verge of saying something. But I will first start, David, just a moment. So on the 23rd December 1943, so in compliance with this decision of the Tehran conference, General Donovan came to Moscow, and on this very day, 23rd December, he was received by Molotov. He was accompanied by Ambassador Harriman, and interpreter was Charles Bolin on the American side, and our interpreter on the Soviet side. General Donovan at that time put forward a very interesting question. Shall we not combine the efforts of your efforts and our efforts in operative field and what we have as means of interference and of actions in occupied countries of Germany? And so actually at that moment, he put forward the idea that maybe in Bulgaria we could organize two services, a coup d'etat, and secure the coming to power of friendly governments to the allies. Molotov replied to that question, but certainly we'll have to promise something to the group which will be able to conduct such an operation.
That operation was in the movie Air Force One. I saw it. It was a combination of coup d'etat, American, Russian. But I think that this is a question.
Not quite. That's not correct. Molotov said that, yes, I understand the point, but you mean that we will have to promise to this group not unconditional surrender, but surrender under more mild conditions. General Donovan said, yes, that's correct. Molotov replied, no, we are ready to do anything, but only with the condition of unconditional surrender of Germany and occupied countries. He consulted that night Stalin and confirmed his position. Certainly, ladies and gentlemen, you realize that at that moment, why we did refuse to cooperate. In the first place, because our advancing armies into Europe were greeted jubilantly, and so we actually hoped that this advance of our armies will give us more influence in Europe and in many countries. And secondly, I must say at this moment that we also had quite good influence in Balkans by way of our good people who were faithful to us, and so we thought that maybe it's not quite necessary to cooperate at this very moment. Well,
I think the question is directed to the future.
Well, it may be directed to the future, but the comments that General Kondrashov has made need some response. In the meeting between General Donovan and Foreign Minister Molotov, and the subsequent meeting with the head of the Soviet Foreign Intelligence, was an excellent example of American naivete during the war, because when General Donovan arrived in Moscow to take up liaison with the Soviet Foreign Intelligence Service, then known as the NKGB, his intentions and the background of his view of cooperating or working with the Soviets in the Balkans, which they considered their private fief, was already well known to the Soviet side through the many penetrations of OSS they had in OSS from the very day that OSS began to work. They knew about OSS personnel, they knew about OSS operations and OSS plans. So the information they were receiving was not only that which they received officially through this liaison, but also was information which they obtained from agents in OSS. Now, does that relate to the future? Of course it does. No nation state, it seems to me, regardless of whether it's Russia or the United States or China, is going to conduct its affairs on the basis of loving friendship played to the background of sweet music. Each state will conduct its affairs in terms of its own national interest. And in the pursuit of that national interest, it is obviously going to have recourse to secret intelligence, because in many cases that's the only way you could be sure that your policies have a chance of success.
Sometimes we are of the same opinion, and I share this opinion.
It's a form of quality control. Did you have a comment on the future of cooperation?
I agree, but I want to say that, of course, the national interests of Russia and the United States can coincide, and sometimes they don't coincide, but there are fields of mutual interest. We are prepared to cooperate with CIA or any other intelligence service of the world, combating, for instance, the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction, drug trafficking, organized crimes, and we can share information to make our world safer.
Really the issue of espionage, organized crime, and things like that.
It doesn't substitute the espionage. We never said that we gave up to spy, and we didn't hear that anybody in London, Paris, Washington, or anywhere in the world said that Russia doesn't represent interest anymore. On the contrary, we had official statements of the former director of CIA who said that despite the fact the Soviet Union ceased to exist, Russia still represents, and Commonwealth countries represent the big interest for the United States and the Western world, and we are continuing to conduct intelligence.
I think we have a consensus here in our answer. Let's go on to our next question.
I have a question for Andrew Stevenson regarding your comments. Would you cite an example to show how American political decision-making was just as blinded by ideology as was Soviet political decision-making during the period in question?
Yeah, I will. On the other hand, my argument was really not about being blinded. I made a counter-argument to the idea that one is necessarily blinded by ideology. I think you can be absolutely right and be ideological. I think, it's very hard to get up in the morning without ideology. And that, my counterpoint was really that the argument of the book situated the Soviet misconceptions solely in terms of ideology. There are other reasons to do it.
I want to clarify, is this the argument of the book, or is it the argument of the preface?
Well, it's the argument of the book as well. But it's clarified, I think, in Jonathan's preface quite clearly. But it seems to me that there are good instances in the book where, and I think David actually agrees with this, or at least the narrative does, the preconceptions, or let's call them misconceptions, even though that's not identical to ideology, actually played a role in how policy was conducted. For example, in 1949, 1950, or 1950, actually, after the outbreak of the Korean War, which Dave was referring to earlier on, there was a simple analogical translation of the Korean example onto the German example. And they believed quite erroneously, on the basis of that false analogy, that the East Germans were going to institute Volkspolizei attacks a la the North Koreans in Germany. That was, to my mind, and actually according to the book as well, a misconception. However, the book then goes on to argue that the misconception was real in the sense that there was a feeling to this effect. And policy then ensued on that assumption. There's also CIA estimates in 1949, which are basically taken right out of the long telegram and the X article and the auxiliary kinds of analysis of that type, and then extrapolated that says that there's going to be a military attack at some stage in Germany, which of course was not the case, and other sources and other places within the establishment knew that quite well. So, but my argument originally was just a counterpoint that it's why believe that the other side is the only one that is mired in ideology. You can be right and be ideological. I don't know. Does that answer your question?
Well, it does answer.
Yes, thank you.
But in the book itself, the argument you're picking up is at most a minor theme. It's not a major theme of the book. Well, of the asymmetries. Okay, let's get back to the subject. Next question.
In the early 1980s, an author known as Peter Wright came out with an extremely controversial book in Great Britain known as Spycatcher. Peter Wright made the revelation that the former head of the British MI5, which is the equivalent of the US FBI, was a Soviet spy in the late 1950s. My question is directed to the two Soviet gentlemen. To the best of your knowledge, how extensive was Soviet penetration in MI5? Specifically, the big question was the former head of MI5, Roger Hollis, as accused by Peter Wright in the book, had anything to do with Soviet intelligence? Margaret Thatcher, as we recall, tried to get this book banned because of its highly controversial nature. I appreciate any insights and thoughts you have regarding Soviet penetration within MI5.
Putting that question, I don't expect that you expect my answer.
What's very clear before we wrap up is that intelligence services, whether it's the CIA or the Soviet intelligence service, they still protect their secrets. You just can't ask. You can ask, and you did ask, and his answer we have.
But
we want to wrap up.
So the British intelligence was well penetrated by Russian intelligence.
I just want to.
If you read the book.
We have to wrap this up, and so let's take the next question. But please, it has to be brief.
Hi, I'm Bill Evans, and I wanted to ask anybody who can comment. I think the most interesting event since World War II was really the Cuban Missile Crisis between Khrushchev and Kennedy. Can anybody comment on that in addition to what's already been published?
I think you're asking about the wrong book.
Right. The subject of the book,
Steve
Battlefield Berlin. I'm sorry, but there are other books, and let's go on to the next question.
Stephen Hadelman, both of you have been rather high-minded about the goals of espionage and what you both were involved in for the last 4 decades. But much of the criticism about, at least certainly the post-Cold War criticism about espionage activities and intelligence agencies has been centered around the fact that particularly the KGB and the CIA spent most of their time spying on each other, that it became sort of a game of spy versus spy where the ultimate goal of policy was almost lost virtually in the in the war games, or secret war games that are going on. Now, I'd like to hear how both of you react to that. Certainly, it's a criticism that was made by General Marcus Wolf, who was, I guess, certainly, Mr. Murphy, your nemesis in Berlin, and your ally, Mr. Kondrashov. So if you could react to that, I'd appreciate it.
Do you think there's been too much attention to the CIA versus the KGB as opposed to the CIA versus the Soviet Union, or the KGB versus the CIA as opposed to the KGB versus the United States? That's the question.
I don't believe that, in fact, despite the impressions that may have gained currency, that either the KGB or CIA were spending too much time attempting to find out what the other was doing. What they were doing, in a straight counterintelligence sense, was to make sure that their operations were not penetrated, that their activities were conducted with reasonable security, and that, however, was not the name of the main game. The name of the main game was to acquire sources in the opposing national structure, not just the intelligence services, but the army, the foreign ministries, the economy, particularly in the field of science and technology. And it was that occupied the intelligence side during the entire Cold War.
Did you work against the American establishment or simply the American intelligence service? Do you think the KGB was too restricted in working against the CIA as opposed to working against the leadership, the political leadership?
Certainly, we are never working against people, against nations, but we are working to pursue our goals in the world affairs and in... I'm sorry? I'm afraid not.
Well, never to the degree one would have liked.
Okay.
I think Sergei is referring to the ultimate events of 1989, 90, 91.
If we're going to move to the last question, Mr. Novaski,
Hi.
the editorial director of The Nation.
Thank you. I'm interested in the politics and the criteria by which the archives of the Cold War are being released in the former Soviet Union. I'm interested in how, for example, you chose the Yale University Press and by what criteria to put out these books. Were the files sold to them, and who runs the auction? And are you satisfied, particularly our Russian guests, are you satisfied that the politics and the criteria for the release of future archives is going to be done in an orderly and appropriate way, including protecting sources, but also including getting out the maximum documents to scholars at the same time?
Maybe the general, you would like to answer this. Okay.
In the process of our work together with David, I got in my possession enormous number of files, and I was either copying the text from the files, if it was impossible to take the document from the file and to xerocopy it, or, and that altogether I made about 250 excerpts from the documents, and then about 85 documents were xerocopied. But each time, as I've chosen the document, I was presenting that through General Kabaladze to the Special Commission on Declassification. On many occasions, either part of a document or a phrase or a line or paragraph were blacked out. But it's a natural process. If the document concerns particular source or information which would lead to a discovery of a source. My only complaint is that certainly I, with my experience in the service, know what is possible to declassify and what is not possible to be classified. And if the young man sitting now
No, you don't.
in some office is judging and he thinks that he's a better judge than myself, that's
Why was Yale selected to publish this book? I was addressing this to your colleague, general publicist. Why was Yale selected? Mr. Navasky wanted to know why Yale, how you negotiated and how you picked Yale.
No, it was entirely Mr. Murphy's and Kondrashev's venture, you know. Russian intelligence is not part of the deal. But if I've got your question right, you are going to write a book. Write me a letter, and we'll consider it, you know.
Thank you.
This request we can't satisfy.
We must break this.